Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. Now, a question that I get very often is, how do I preserve all of the food for eating over winter? And I'm going to give you an honest answer. I try and avoid it as much as possible, and this video will share why. So I actually like to take a little bit of a different approach when it comes to how I eat from the garden during all 4 seasons. And this approach would also suit you if you feel that you're very strapped for time, because I don't want to get into that position where it's kind of late summer into early to mid-autumn and there's just so much food that needs preserving that isn't going to last when the frosts start coming. It's been a weird year this year because we still haven't had a frost yet and it is mid-November. But for me as a gardener, I don't want to feel like I'm rushing to get everything in and ready. I understand that my climate being a temperate climate, I don't have winters that means that the ground is completely frozen solid for 3 months, for example. So instead, I like to shift my priorities a little bit. So my lazy approach to preserving food for over winter is to prioritise having a greater percentage area of the vegetable garden to be growing winter vegetables, rather than just being so set on all of the summer and autumn crops, to actually make sure that I section off spaces. For example, in front of me here, this is purple sprouting broccoli and I've got leeks that allow me to have a lot of food over winter time. You see, unlike summer vegetables, winter crops come with a specific list of benefits that I love. The first thing is that over winter, they're not going to bolt. Most of the time, unless they're in a polytunnel, they don't need watering. Keeping down on the weeds is super easy because we've got so much time, and they just sit here for us to just come up to the garden whenever we want a little bit of extra food. So this kale here, this is going to be perfectly happy until March or April time, just sitting here. I can harvest what I want, it will continue to gradually produce, and then in springtime it's going to create a forest of flower shoots that I can also enjoy eating during the hungry gap. When you're growing something like peas, for example, you have to keep on harvesting them, and then if you're wanting to freeze them, you've got to pod them and all of those kind of things, and then they're gone. The space is finished. They don't just sit there and you can think, oh, tell you what, I've got enough food now, I'll just harvest you guys in 2 months. It doesn't work like that. With winter vegetables though, it does. I think the best way to get the most from your garden when you're a little bit strapped for time is to embrace and work with the seasons as much as possible and to understand the type of climate that you live in. And so usually for us up until Christmas time, it's a little bit warmer and wetter. So for example, this pak choy here, I can grow this outside and enjoy it up until around December time because I'm working with the seasons. Our coldest times tend to be kind of mid-winter to early spring. Now in fact this spring we had 22 frosts in April alone. So there's a lot more colder weather closer to the growing season than towards, say, the end of a growing season, and I try and base my plantings around that. So of course I do a little bit of preserving for winter, and it's mainly things like tomatoes, which is such a lovely taste to enjoy in the darkest of months, and then pumpkins, for example, other things like that. But for the most part, I like to keep my food out in the garden as much as possible, so I'm not spending that time prepping it, whether it's freezing, blanching, pre-cooking, all of those things. Instead, the food is just out here in the garden sitting and waiting for me to just come and take exactly what I want. And I've also found that that's a nice way to reduce food waste because I'm only coming up to the garden to harvest what I need. Even say on Christmas Day I can come up and get some cabbage, for example, and Brussels sprouts. Now undercover spaces are an interesting topic for over winter and getting food from the garden. Things like cold frames. This here is a cold frame that I've designed myself and is available on my shop hughesgarden.com, where everything that you need gardening is available. I've got some carrots growing under here, Paris market carrots, nice and small. They're starting to develop in size. I can show you this one here, very cute, but the greens of carrots are nice and edible as well. So If you do have undercover growing space, yes, it's an amazing way to grow things in summer to create a much warmer climate, so I can grow things like aubergines. But for winter, they're just as vital, just as important. If you say don't have space, or you don't have a polytunnel or greenhouse, you can grow a huge amount of winter salads in a cold frame like this. You've got different things like corn salad, purslane for example, chard that you can harvest all through winter. So I use undercover growing spaces to prioritise growing more leafy green salad type crops over winter. But for my actual staple crops, the things that I really enjoy and truly want to eat that are nice and warming over winter, I like to grow those outside in the beds. So obviously being in Wales and leeks being our national vegetable, they are perhaps my biggest staple in terms of what I get from the winter garden. Leeks are amazing because firstly they taste epic. There's not many vegetables that I think taste better than a leek. And the other thing is that they just store in the ground so well. I'll be harvesting leeks usually up until the end of March. So from November until March, if I have a whole bed of leeks, that's a huge amount of food. And the other thing that's lovely about leeks is that, unlike some other winter vegetables which need a much longer span of growth to occupy a whole bed, I usually succession plant these after, say, some new potatoes or broad beans. I then transplant the leeks into that ground. So I'm still getting a crop early in the season from the same bed. But these leeks now, the amount that you can fit in a small space is a huge and fantastic staple to enjoy over winter. If you know this channel, you know I'm also going to say that another staple of mine are Jerusalem artichokes, also known as sunchokes. We've got a patch here that has been our sunchoke patch for around about 15 years. Super productive. We've just cut the tops off earlier today because they've fully died back. Great compost material, by the way. And this, again, is going to yield kilos and kilos of Jerusalem artichokes over winter. And there's something that is, again, it just stores in the ground. Whenever you need some, you just come up, you harvest a plant or a couple of plants, take the tubers back, and you can keep on doing that up until around mid-March when they start to resprout again. So again, a huge amount of food, very minimal work for what you get from this space. Another staple for winter for me is beetroot. This is albino beetroot, so delicious, so sweet. Now, I found that beetroot does seem to overwinter pretty well up until around late January, early February. If you're a little bit concerned, you can mulch with, say, a load of leaves or straw or something just to help protect them. But I found that they just sit really nicely in the ground. And again, for at least the first half of winter, I can come up and harvest the roots whenever I need. Such a tasty, versatile vegetable to grow. Another great winter tuber to enjoy is oca, New Zealand yam, which is what is kind of cascading over this bed here. We've just harvested some earlier today just because of doing a little bit of clearing, so it's nice to already have some tubers. But typically I'll start to harvest these around December up until February time. They work great in containers, they work really well in raised beds. However, if you don't pick up every single tuber, you will suddenly find that you have oca there again next year, which I don't think is ever a bad thing. It's just something to know. It likes to spread, but it's also delicious and productive. My favourite way to enjoy it in terms of eating is roasted with a little bit of salt. For staple leafy crops that stand up better to cooking, for example, kale, which I've already mentioned, there's also this. This is Asturian tree cabbage, which this is one of the smaller leaves of the lot, but this I think is delicious. I like to cut it up and cook it, pan fried for example. You can wrap things in it and roast it. It tastes just like cabbage, but unlike cabbage where sometimes you can find maybe some like caterpillars inside, or it gets a bit dirty, or it starts to rot from the inside, this seems to stand much better being outside over winter. So if you love cabbage and you like the flavour, by the way, this goes really well cooked with leeks. I've actually found that in terms of hardiness and self-sufficiency from the garden over the winter months, this Asturian tree cabbage is absolutely amazing. Earlier this year I did a video about why I was growing potatoes in containers, and this actually helps with the lazy way of preserving food over winter, because the potatoes are in here and they're actually really happy sitting in soil. Just like, say, oca or Jerusalem artichokes, we all know where we've harvested potatoes, perhaps missed a couple, and they just appear the next year. So what I'm doing here, I've just got a couple of spuds here. I can tip this all out, for example, but I don't want to go into the effort of having to maybe dry these off, store them in a sack somewhere and worry about them rotting. Instead, I find it much easier to carry the whole container into a frost-free place, for example a shed, and then gradually over winter, whenever I need more spuds, I go in, I empty one of these out onto a bed, because this makes an excellent mulch, and I've got the potatoes that I need. Again, saving a lot of time. And so in a nutshell, the lazy way to preserve food over winter is to embrace the qualities and the benefits of winter vegetables, rather than investing a lot of your time into summer and autumn crops. So as we're starting to think about next growing season and we're getting into the planning stages, have a little bit of fun with just seeing whether perhaps dedicating a bit more space in your garden to winter crops will make sense to you. How would that winter look? How would the time during your time during summer and autumn change and differ? So let me know how you feel about this approach to preserving food over winter. And if you're wanting to know what to do with all of the weeds that you're currently clearing out of your garden, this video right here shows you a real simple method to make the most of those nutrients.